Why write upon the old subject of the freedom of the will? The answer to this question will involve a recital of personal history, which will in part be justified by, and will derive its chief interest from, the fact that it implicates an allusion to the progressive thinking upon this subject of one of the greatest men of the present century. In the year 1849, while a licensed probationer for the gospel ministry, I took up a sermon in pamphlet form by Dr. James H. Thornwell on the necessity of the atonement, for the purpose of devoting a day to its study. Before the reading had proceeded far, this utterance was encountered. The only efficient cause which exists in the universe is the fiat of the deity. This led to the following reasoning. If this be true, then the will of God is the sole efficient cause of moral things, consequently of sin, for sin is a moral thing. If so, where is the right of God to punish sin? How is it conceivable that he would punish what he himself produces? Concluding that the limitation of my own faculties disabled me from solving the problem, I determined when opportunity offered to refer the difficulty to Dr. Thornwell. Attendance upon an ecclesiastical meeting in Columbia furnished the coveted opportunity. Calling upon him at his study in the campus of the South Carolina College, I begged him to excuse me for troubling him for the reason that he had got me into trouble. "What is the matter?" he kindly inquired. The foregoing statement was then made to him. "Doctor," asked I, "what do you do with this difficulty?" "I cannot do anything with it," he replied. "It is an insuperable difficulty on the scheme of necessity." "Doctor, do you rest there?" "Not exactly," said he. "There is a more formidable difficulty on the scheme of liberty. It is the difficulty of an absolute commencement, implied in every free act of the will. Neither of them is solvable, but between the two I elect what seems to be the less, that which you have adduced as inhering in the scheme of necessity." I thanked him and retired to cope again with the gigantic problem. Unable to concur with Dr. Thornwell, I reached, after painful reflection, the conclusion that as God by creation imparted to the intellect the power to think, to the feelings the power to perceive beauty and deformity, pleasure and pain, to the conscience the power to pass moral judgments, so he imparted to the will the power efficiently to cause acts, and held man responsible to him for the exercise of this power, bounding, ordering, and controlling it for the ends of his government. Holding to this conclusion, it was not made obtrusive because the presumption, created by the views of such a thinker as Thornwell, was against it. I continued, however, to reflect upon the subject. During the war between the states, Jonathan Edwards' work on the will was one of my companions, and was carefully studied whenever active operations gave way to the quiet of camp life. In 1871, the first 2 volumes of Dr. Thornwell's collected writings were issued. As soon as they were received, not having had the opportunity of examining his manuscript lectures in theology, I at once turned to his discussion of sin in order to ascertain his latest thinking on the question of its origin, and came across these utterances. Quote, "The moderate Calvinists, who have seen the prominence which the Scriptures everywhere give to human agency, especially in the matter of sin, who have felt in their own souls that there were thoughts, words, and deeds, states, and affections of the soul, which were truly theirs, which began in the will as the immediate cause, have been compelled to admit that there is a sphere in which God leaves personal agents to themselves, and in which they are permitted to act as real efficient causes. So in innocence Adam was left to the freedom of his will. The divine ordination in this sphere of liberty does not impine upon the creature's efficiency. He is the author of the deeds. We should give to God the glory of his supremacy. We should not deny to the creature the properties that God has bestowed. We should not be afraid to say, my act, or my thought, or my feeling, because whatever is positive or real in these functions should be ascribed only to God. They are ours by a power which God imparted to us, and every abuse of these faculties is an act which must be ascribed in all its relations to the will of the creature, and the creature alone." End quote. It was evident that Dr. Thornwell had abandoned the necessitarian position which years before I had found him occupying. My surprise was great, and springing to my feet I exclaimed, "Why, I need not have been so cautious in expressing the views I held, for Dr. Thornwell has in his last thinking announced them." Substantially, though not so clearly, the same ground I discovered to be taken by Dr. Charles Hodge in his systematic theology, which, by a curious providence, came out very shortly after Dr. Thornwell's writings were published. The necessitarianism of Edwards was obviously not the norm of recent Calvinistic thought. It had been grafted by his powerful hand into the theology of the Reformed Church, and for a time, in this country, almost dominated it. But it became evident that the Calvinistic theology is extricating itself from the iron embrace of the necessitarian philosophy as one of universal application. In 1877, a controversy involving the theological relations of the will occurred between two distinguished combatants, conducted on the one side in the Methodist Quarterly Review and on the other in the Southern Presbyterian Review. In the progress and results, so far as reached, of this debate, I became intensely interested and published 2 articles in the Southern Presbyterian Review on the subject of the freedom of the will in its theological relations. These articles were challenged and criticized by an able writer in the pages of the same review. This led to the addition of 4 articles, making 6 in all, which were published in the review. The remaining part of the work was subsequently written and has slumbered until now in manuscript form. The consent of the proprietor of the Southern Presbyterian Review has been obtained to the republication in independent form of the articles in that quarterly, and such alterations have been made as I deemed advisable. The nature of the discussion, as being to a considerable extent controversial, has rendered it necessary to retain the original dress and style of articles. To have reduced it to the form of a didactic treatise, which on some accounts was desirable, would have destroyed whatever of dramatic interest attaches to it, and have involved great labor and an expenditure of time demanded by other and pressing engagements. There is, however, it is believed, a sufficient amount of dispassionate analysis and didactic exposition to relieve it of the appearance of a personal defense. For its polemical character, no apology is offered. The great work of Edwards was avowedly polemic. Truth is always most clearly presented in its contrast to error. In an important respect, the present work, although undertaken for other reasons and complete in itself, is complementary to one published by the author last year entitled Calvinism and Evangelical Arminianism. In that work, some of the main positions touching the relation of the divine agency to sin were simply asserted as being in point of fact sustained by the consensus of the Calvinistic theology. In this volume, they indirectly meet with a formal vindication. As the result of an humble, sincere, laborious investigation of a subject abstract indeed in its fundamental principles, but profoundly and awfully practical in its applications, this book is committed to the hands of that eternal Spirit who expresses the sevenfold wisdom of God, and who is promised by Christ the prophet of the church to guide into all truth those who are willing to be disciples in his school. Columbia, South Carolina, May 25th, 1891.